Invincible Louisa by Cornelia Meigs. 5. The Girl I Left Behind Me. No one will ever know how hard for Louisa were those first years of making her way alone. Excessive shyness is not the best equipment for facing a strange and unreceptive world in which the struggle for a living is already overcrowded. Louisa was not only shy, but she was very sensitive to all, as all creative persons must be. To offset such handicaps, she had only courage, unquenchable courage, which could usually laugh at hurt feelings and discomfitures, and always rose from a fall to try again. Her cousins, the Sewells, gave her a place to stay that winter, while she worked at teaching, sewing, at anything to which she could turn her industrious hands. She wrote and wrote and wrote. The stories were strange, melodramatic, lurid compositions, still full of matter of which she really knew nothing. They were vigorously written, however, and began to be sold for small sums here and there. Bronson Alcott had taken one of them to a friend of his, who was then editor of a famous magazine. "Tell Louisa to stick to her teaching," the gentleman said kindly. "She is never going to be a writer." Was Louisa crushed when she heard his verdict? "I will not stick to my teaching. I will be a writer," she declared, "and I will write for his magazine, too." She did, but not during this difficult period. A friend of her mother's had 3 young daughters, 2 of whom Louisa had taught while the Alcotts still lived in Boston. The youngest was an invalid who could not go to school. Louisa taught her for part of every day and spent the rest of the time in sewing and writing. People were not particularly kind to anyone in Louisa's struggling position. Teaching was really considered to be the only fairly respectable pursuit for young ladies, and even that was looked down upon by those who thought at that time that leisure was more dignified than work. Louisa had no such false ideas. She was, moreover, spurned by an indomitable purpose. She was not only going to support herself, but she was later going to uphold the family fortunes. At first, it was all she could possibly do to stand upon her own feet. She was worn out with discouragement, and was presently made more unhappy by bad news from the little house in the New Hampshire hills. Mrs. Alcott had interested herself in a very poor family there, where some children were ill from living in an unsanitary house. The owner, a deacon of the church, refused to have it put in order until spirited Abba Alcott said that she would bring suit against him. When he gave in, it was too late. The children in the family were sick with scarlet fever. The contagion was carried to the Alcott house, and May and Elizabeth both were taken ill. Elizabeth was in great danger for some time, so that Louisa was summoned from Boston. Quiet little Elizabeth, unhappy over a small love affair which had not gone properly, very ill besides, was near death, but finally won her way back in some semblance of the health she had known before. It was not until autumn that Louisa set forth again, this time with a desperately heavy heart. Elizabeth did not get back any real strength, and they were all seriously anxious about her. The family in Walpole was slowly coming to the decision to return to Concord, where Betty could be nearer to medical advice, and where Bronson could be far happier in the neighborhood of his dear friend Emerson. Louisa declared that she could try Bronson again, being wiser for her failures. As she did, she wrote in her journal, "I don't often pray in words, but when I set out that day, with all my goods in a little old trunk, my own very small earnings in my pocket, and much hope and resolution in my soul, my heart was very full, and I said to the Lord, 'Help us all and keep us for one another,' as I never said it before, while I looked back at the dear faces watching me, so full of love and hope and faith." It is pathetic to think what faith they all had in her, poor toiling Louisa. It must have been hard indeed to go away with that threatening shadow already upon her house. She returned to Boston in the hope that she could once more teach the little invalid Alice. But the first news which met her was that she would not be needed. That was not cheering, but she did not lose heart. At the boarding house of Mrs. Reed, she arranged to have a little attic room, in return for which she was to sew a certain number of hours every day. But she must find something further to do, for merely a roof over her head was not enough. Search for employment was unusually disheartening, but various things happened to cheer her. Cousin Lizzie Wells gave her tickets to a course of lectures. great riches to Louisa, to whom such opportunities were not often open. The practical cousin appended to the gift the presents of a coat in which to go to the lectures, an exceedingly thoughtful addition. Another cousin procured for Louisa a pass to go to the theater, so that she reveled in high dramatic moments. She was sent for at last to go to Beacon Street to teach little Alice after all, and with her sewing and the sale of stories, she began to feel safely independent. No matter how busy she was, she managed to find time to teach in a little mission Sunday school, what we would now call a settlement. It was one of the Alcott's beliefs that no matter how poor a person is, he or she always has something which could be given away. Louisa was very homesick. From the beginning of time that she knew how to write, she had kept a journal, at first full of brief entries put down in a large misshapen hand, interspersed with little notes by her mother. It was Abba Alcott's habit to look into the diaries, which were always open to her, and write brief letters to her children amongst the pages of uncertain writing. I have observed all day your patience with baby, your obedience to me, your kindness to all. After one of Louisa's tempests, a furious temper which broke out from time to time when she was small, with this comment, I was grieved at your selfish behavior this morning, but also greatly pleased to find you bore so meekly father's reproof of it. I know that you will have a happy day after the storm. Keep quiet, read, walk, but do not talk much till all is peace again. The girl's outbursts were of a somewhat different style now, although more than once she resented hotly the fact that things were so easy for many whom she saw about her, and so hard for her beloved family. That care should so weigh down her courageous mother. After the storm, however, always came determination. Things should be better. They would be made so by Louisa. She missed her mother's wise presence and the cheery notes, but she struggled forward. Cousin Lizzie Wells, not weary of well-doing, had given her a dress, my first new silk dress, as Louisa recorded it. I felt as if all the Hancocks and Quinceys beheld me as I went to 2 parties in it on New Year's Eve, her journal declared. Possibly she was conscious that, on certain occasions, the Quinceys and the Hancocks would not have quite approved of all the casual doings and the informal costumes of the Alcott connection. One happiness was always open to her. On Sunday evenings, she would go to the house of some dear friend of her father's and of her own, Mr. and Mrs. Theodore Parker. Next to the Emersons, perhaps even equal to them, were these friends in their influence on Louisa's life. Theodore Parker had been brought up on a farm outside Lexington, only a few miles from Concord, and loved all that rock-dotted, pine-clad farming country as she did. And, as she knew, dreamed of it in the crowded, narrow streets of Boston. His struggle for an education had been something like her father's. Although he had got his learning by great effort from Harvard, he became finally a minister, and at this time in Boston was commanding a figure in the religious life and the political thought of the time. Calm Boston was beginning to seethe with excitement, as it had not done since the storm of the Revolution was gathering since the great moment of the Boston Tea Party. The feeling against slavery, long held in check, was now rolling up into a tremendous wave, which was to break, crashing into the vast catastrophe of war. Louisa could remember that her father's friend, William Lloyd Garrison, was dragged through the streets by a mob made up of gentlemen of substance and property, who threatened to hang him for being an abolitionist. Now, a mob wrought to a high pitch by a very different feeling, rescued the fugitive slave, Shadrach, and carried him away to liberty. Again, when the runaway Negro Burns was lodged in the city jail, preparatory to returning him to his master, as was now the strict law, once more a mob attempted to assault the prison for the purpose of setting him free. He was too well guarded, however, and there was not sufficient plan against the rescuers to accomplish their ends. A deputy marshal was killed, revolvers drove back the crowd, the last to retreat being none other than Bronson Alcott. Theodore Parker stayed, an eminent minister, the most crowd-drawing preacher in Boston, as Lowell described him, concealed a runaway slave woman in his house. He sat with a drawn pistol on the table beside him, writing his sermon for the next Sunday, ready in case any immediate interruption by the officers of the law to defend the poor fugitive to the point of bloodshed. A picturesque adventurer of his was that concerning Ellen Craft and her husband William. The two Negroes had fled from the South and were hidden in different places in and about Boston for a number of months, whispers of their whereabouts having come to the ears of the authorities. There was finally such danger of their being captured and taken back that arrangements were made by their anti-slavery friends to smuggle them to England. The night before they were to be put on board ship, they sent for Theodore Parker. They had something to explain to him, a great service to ask. They were husband and wife, but not by any formal marriage. The institution of slavery did not take any special account of marriage. If a man were sold away from his wife, both of them, under new masters, were supposed to take new mates. But these two, whom nothing could part, wanted now to be really married, as free people were. They begged that Parker perform the service over them before they sailed. In the dark little boarding house, their last refuge before putting to sea, he went through the marriage ceremony. Armed men guarded the door, lest there be interruption. Into the body of the prayers and vows, Parker introduced the stern admonition that the husband must defend his wife's liberty against all comers. As the service closed, the minister took up 2 gifts and handed them to the bridegroom. A Bible for the defense of your soul, he said, and a great bowie knife for the defense of your body. There is no wonder that Louisa loved and admired such a man. Comfortable, sympathetic Mrs. Parker, befriending people in unending numbers, was interested in Louisa and came to see her in her sky parlor, and was always delighted to welcome her to their house, where the truly great people of the time came together. Mr. Parker, a sturdy figure, not very tall, a man with direct blue-gray eyes and a straight, determined mouth, went here and there amongst his guests. He had not much time for the tall, bashful girl in the corner, but he had always the right word. "Well, child, how goes it? Pretty well? That's brave." And he would go on to speak to someone else. He would bid her good night. "God bless you, Louisa. Come again." And she would go home, brave, with the pure contagion of a dauntless spirit. "He is like a great fire," she said of him in her journal, "where all can come and be warmed and comforted." When June came, she went back to Walpole, increasingly troubled about Elizabeth. When she saw her after her weeks of absence, she realized the desperate possibility which was before them all. The move to Concord, long weighed, was now decided upon. After much thought, it was agreed that it would be better to buy a house and revive, if it were still possible, something of that easy happiness of those earlier days at Hillside. That house was no longer available, for it belonged now to a friend of the Alcotts, a shy man grown to be famous and hating his prominence, Nathaniel Hawthorne. A place a little nearer the town was possible to procure, however, a piece of ground lying below the same ridge of pine and birch-growth hill, fronting also on the Lexington road. There was a house upon the land, so old and dilapidated a building that the former owner threw in with the bargain, not counting it as possible that anything could be done about it, but to tear it down. He did not know the resourceful Alcotts. Mrs. Alcott took Elizabeth to Boston, while Louisa and Anna attended to the affairs of moving. They packed again. How many times was it now? They had not the heart to try to remember. So much had to be done to the old house in which they had meant to live, that they were obliged to take other quarters for the immediate present, part of a double house near the Concord Town Hall. A room was made comfortable for Lizzie, and all the old-time neighbors came pouring in to welcome the Alcotts back to Concord. Bronson, Louisa, Anna, and May fell to work to see what could be done with the newly acquired dwelling. There were fruit trees about it, so that it was christened officially Orchard House. Louisa, however, had a different name for it. In their family, there was a certain New England pudding made of apples, a homely dish, much loved by them all, but of no great elegance. She named the house after it, Apple Slump. The poor, dejected old dwelling, which must somehow be a home to them, seemed to take kindly to the name. It began to come to life quite suddenly under their hands. Bronson worked hard upon the grounds, for he had a gift with gardens, and made this one prosper. The untended fruit trees were cared for, the growth cleared away from about the 100-year-old elm, which stood near the gate, and which had seen the Minutemen go by. Anna and Louisa scrubbed and polished, contrived closets and cupboards, made the most of the old beams and rafters, and turned dusty corners into alcoves for books. All three of the girls painted and papered, while May made decorative panels for the walls. Their friend, William Ellery Channing, composed a motto for the low-ceilinged room at the left of the doorway, which was to be Bronson's study. May painted the words over the chimney-piece. The hills are reared, the valleys scooped in vain, if learning's altars vanish from the plain. They worked all through the winter, since without money they could make no great speed. For Elizabeth's sake, they strove to seem to be happy, and presently, through the very effort, accomplished something of the reality. Mr. Frank B. Sanborn, another dear and distinguished friend, had a school for boys not far away. The girls threw themselves into the dramatics there, and organized, coached, and staged many a thrilling or comic play. Elizabeth loved to see the preparations, to watch the costumes take shape, and hear of the success with which these efforts were received. It was like the days of Rodrigo's boots come back again. The Miss Elizabeth Peabody, dear friend of them all, who had been Mr. Alcott's assistant at the Temple School, and for whom Elizabeth Alcott was named, had a sister who had also helped there. This sister married Nathaniel Hawthorne, and her children, some years younger than the Alcotts, lived near and were constant companions of the four girls. Julian Hawthorne, who was attending the Sanborn School, went past the house every day and always stopped for talk and laughter. He was somewhat younger than May, the youngest Alcott, but it was one of Louisa's family jokes that he developed a tender passion for this younger sister. Louisa used to hold forth on the hopelessness of poor Julian's attachment, since a mythical cousin from England, a vague person of highest rank and fortune, was to arrive some day and carry May away to pursue a life in the exalted ranks of the titled great. One evening, just at dusk, Julian was walking down the road past the house when a strange and horrifying sight met him. May was standing at the gate, and beside her was a tall stranger, carrying a foppish cane, dressed with a slight eccentricity which must be foreign, possessed of bold dark eyes and a small black mustache. The astounding thing was that his arm was about May's waist, evidently without her protest or objection. Julian approached, his eyes fairly staring from his head, and was introduced to "our cousin." The foreigner stepped forward, bowed, and acknowledged the introduction with an insolent patronage of manner which the boy could not endure. "Well, well, so this is our young friend Julian, quite a well-grown boy." Intolerable talk to a lad who had cast something in the nature of adoring eyes at May. Julian stepped up to the stranger and was received by the flourish of a cane in his face, twirled with an apparent carelessness by the English youth, but nonetheless uncomfortably and threateningly near. The American boy clenched his fists, and suddenly May, apparently overcome, turned and took flight toward the house. The Englishman took one more provocative step forward, then amazingly snatched off the black mustache and threw it over Julian's head, following with the black felt hat which had created such a rakish foreign impression. The removal of the hat brought down a flood of dark hair. Julian Hawthorne said of the scene long afterwards, "Then Louisa turned and pursued May up the path, whooping like a Comanche, but with a feminine consciousness, I fancied, of the pantaloons." It was perhaps their last hilarious occasion. As the autumn and winter drew on, Elizabeth became steadily worse. By January, all knew that nothing further was to be done. Even she herself knew it, and faced the end with that inflexible, heroic bravery that so often resides in quiet people. She loved to have Louisa near her. "It makes me feel strong," so she said. Anna took charge of the house, while Louisa and her mother gave themselves up to nursing. It was March when Elizabeth went away. Louisa saw her go with that strange, numb calmness that attends an agonizing grief when it cannot be averted. Elizabeth was glad to be at rest. No one could begrudge her the freedom from suffering which she had finally won, when, on the same breath where she had drawn her first breath, she quietly drew her last. An inconspicuous, beautiful, unselfish life coming to an almost imperceptible close. In the next year, Theodore Parker was to die, and Louisa was to go to the vast memorial service and music hall, where floods of sunshine, great hopes, and flowers, and the eloquence of the foremost men of his day were to bear witness to his greatness. And yet, more hearts, thousands more perhaps, have been wrung by the death of Elizabeth Alcott, unassuming, courageous little Beth, than by the passing of that famous man. Why? Not through Louisa's genius alone, but through the unsurpassed beauty of that life which it was Louisa's privilege to picture when the time came. Life goes on after sorrow, in spite of sorrow, as a defense against sorrow. Louisa had a burden of debt to carry now, a sordid addition to her weight of grief. The money which had bought the old house was little, carefully guarded capital of Mrs. Alcott's, left her by her father. The great step of spending it had been decided on in the hope that it might save Elizabeth or give her a happy, comfortable place in which to spend her last days of life. It had accomplished neither. Louisa cherished an unreasoned enmity for the house forever after, knowing that the feeling was not just, but still unable to restrain it. They were committed to living there now, however, and must go forward with their preparations. The Hawthorns, who had bought Hillside, were to be away, and offered the Alcotts the use of their place until the repairs on Orchard House should at last be finished. So the family moved into one wing, where Louisa lived again for a few months, where they had been so happy in those first rich years. They were still here when another change came upon them, a thing against which Louisa stormed aloud, although she must surely have foreseen its coming. There is always a memory of comradeship between people who have had in common certain outstanding adventures in life. At the time that the Fruitlands enterprise was going on, various other experiments in community living were being tried in other places. A number of people whom Bronson and Abba Alcott knew were concerned with Brook Farm, where lived a company of people who held their property in common, as did the community at Fruitlands. It was a larger undertaking than the Fruitlands experiment, and lasted a little longer, and while it came to an end through disagreement of its members, as all such experiments did, it was not concluded under the same cloud of tragedy as was Bronson Alcott's unhappy venture. Emerson was interested in both of them. Nathaniel Hawthorne was one of the Brook Farm members, as were also a family of Hosmers and a family of Pratts. Hawthorne and Emerson were the Alcotts' dear friends always. So were the Hosmers, who took the destitute family into their own house when the move was made from Still River back to Concord. Without that connection, it is probable that Bronson would not have let his girls go to their single term of school, for it was John Hosmer, of the same family, who taught them that winter. There were also close bonds between the Alcotts and the Pratts, who had taken a farm of their own after Brook Farm ended, and had lived there ever since. At this time of sorrow, Anna went to visit the Pratts in the country, and came home to give the family news of great import. She walked into the parlor, and launched the momentous tidings at once. She was engaged to the son of the house, John Bridge Pratt. Once in the Hillside days, a boy in the midst of a game at a party had kissed Anna. Louisa raged and stormed over such impertinence, and always forever after spoke of the unfortunate youth with scorn. Kissing was not an approved custom among the Alcotts. She raged in much the same manner now. She wanted Anna to be happy. She liked John Pratt, but why, oh why, should families have to separate? She lamented continually and bitterly, although not in Anna's hearing. Cousin Lizzie Wells came to the rescue while Louisa was in this distracted mood, and carried her away for a visit to Boston. It was during that brief stay that Louisa put into execution a long-laid plan. She determined now to make a real, definite effort to go upon the stage. Money was earned so slowly by sewing and writing, and the pursuit of it was so humdrum. If she could only have adventure and excitement and applause, and could reap the financial rewards that sounded so dazzling and golden, what could she not do then for her beloved ones? A friend of her father's, Dr. Winship, had given her an introduction to a certain manager, a Mr. Barry. To this Mr. Barry, she repaired, and asked if he would give her a place for trial. Would he let her appear, she requested, just to see what she could do with comedy. The manager looked her over attentively, a tall girl with a big mouth, brilliant eyes, and a mass of wavy chestnut hair. Her features were not beautiful, but her expression was, for it lightened her face, and made her not only striking, but lovely. No one who looked at her ever failed to see the strong character and earnest purpose which always burned behind those dark eyes. Mr. Barry hesitated, knowing that a young person of her connections did not often offer herself for life on the stage. He demurred, but her enthusiasm overbore him, and he found himself promising her a place. Would she care to try the Widow Pottle, a character part, and a very small one? She would indeed. It was better, they both agreed, that no one should know who she was until after the trial had been made. She went out from the interview in a mood of high exaltation. Mr. Barry may have thought that the whole thing was something of a joke, the cheerful prank of a spirited young lady. To her it was a matter of tremendous importance. Already as she walked home she was seeing visions of herself in the life of an actress. Memories of the first pleasant flush of success came back to her, the recollection of the drama in the old barn where she had trod the boards in Rodrigo's boots. No one with such soaring hopes as Louisa had could fail to be disappointed, not once but many times in life. Long after, she once said of herself that disappointment must be good for her. She got so much of it. She learned to meet it bravely, although often she felt at first only a hot wave of revolt. Disappointment came now, for Mr. Barry was hurt in an accident, and the play containing the Widow Pottle had to be given up. Louisa stormed again, for it seemed as though misfortune were singling her out of special purpose. After a day of lamentation, she faced the issue bravely. She admitted to herself that she had craved the unusualness and the exciting stimulus of such a life, rather than that she had felt any great call to it. She steadied her spirits and went home to Concord to help the others settle at last in the orchard house, to enjoy the look of peace on her mother's face as she went about in a dwelling which at last seemed tolerably permanent. Louisa wrote busily all summer, always with the interesting spur of some special thing she wanted to get for the new household, a carpet, a ream of paper for her father, or dresses for various members of the family. Between tales, she got out her best silk dress and made it over, the same one which Cousin Lizzie Wells had given her years before. It was a dark summer for her, with one parting behind her and another before her, and a sense of rebellion still that such things should separate the people she loved. In the autumn she went once more to Boston to see what work she could find to do. At no time in her life had she ever fallen so low in spirits as now. She was discontented with her old, drudging ways of making a living. She was lonely, sad, and unbelievably disheartened. She was full of life always, but now she wished suddenly and deeply that she could die. She did not want to go on living in a world where everything was so hard. She trudged here and there, looking for employment, and did not find it. That seemed almost the last detail of discouraging circumstance. But unquenchable Louisa was not utterly submerged even now. There is work for me to do, and I will find it, she told herself fiercely, and in that very challenge overthrew something of her discouragement. It was on her dreariest and most disheartened Sunday that she went to hear Theodore Parker preach. By one of those rare coincidences which are more than chance, his sermon that day was, so it seemed for her alone. Laborious young women was the subject, for he had deemed it time to say some words to those misunderstood, toiling girls for whom there were so few opportunities and so little encouragement. He poured out for them that blessing of knowledge concerning which he was so sure, that absolute certainty of where they were to look for sustaining help when the way seemed impossible to pursue further. For Louisa, that Sunday service was a landmark in her life. It was like that morning when she was a little girl and saw the sun coming up over the Concord meadows and the silent river, when she knew suddenly all the beauty and goodness of God. She felt that she understood ever after what God was. Today, sitting in the crowded church, She went forward to a new feeling. She understood what God wanted her to do. She had never lost heart so completely before. She was never to lose it again in just that way. There was one, at least, in Theodore Parker's congregation that day who carried away courage and faith to such a degree that if he had reached no other heart, his preaching would have been gloriously repaid. Louisa was probably only one of hundreds who heard and was comforted. She was one who not only pondered upon his counsel, but set out immediately with her usual energy to put it into effect. She went to Mrs. Parker and asked if she knew of something, anything, which an energetic girl could do to help her family. There was nothing immediately available, but good, ever-helpful Mrs. Parker would see. As she walked home, Louisa met the mother of her little invalid pupil, Alice. The child had been considered well enough at last to go to school and not have needed Louisa's instructions, and had not needed Louisa's instructions. Alice was not happy at school, her mother said now. Perhaps they would have Louisa to teach her after all. She would send word later. Louisa went home and waited, but no word came. In the meantime, a place was offered her through Mrs. Parker. Would she go to the girls' reform school at Lancaster and sew 10 hours a day on uniforms and on mending sheets and towels? Louisa listened to the suggestion with a surge of repulsion. To work in a prison, to sew from morning till night with no time for anything else? But she must find something, and this was all that was available. If Alice's mother does not take me, I will go, she determined. Another day passed. She packed her belongings, made her preparations, hating this prospect with all the force of her spirit, but bound that she would carry out her resolution to take what work she could do. The last evening, just as she was about to leave, came a knock on the door and a message. Alice and her mother wanted her again. A salary was offered which would make it possible for her to live in Boston, to occupy her little sky parlor once more, and to write. She sent word in a great splendid wave of relief that she would stay. There were other people to take the girls' reform school work, people who were not young and sensitive and discouraged. They were not in the depths of a depression, which needed above all things some brighter atmosphere, than that prevailing in a woman's prison in the 50s. Such were not cheerful or wholesome places for persons of Louisa's temperament. Mrs. Parker had grieved over it, but had felt that it was better than nothing. When she told her husband how Louisa had stood to her determination to the very last minute, Theodore Parker uttered a solemn prophecy. "Louisa," he said, "is going to succeed." He did not live to see his words fulfilled, for he was already in the grip of that illness which was to end his life a few months later. But he had his great share in her success nonetheless. In the spring, Louisa went home to Anna's wedding. A very simple ceremony it was, but with such dear friends to attend it, and with such deep happiness everywhere, that it seemed to stand apart from other weddings. Abba Alcott's brother, Samuel Joseph May, performed the marriage. He had married Abba and Bronson on the same day and month, 31 years earlier. The wedding, at Orchard House, ended with a dance on the grass outside under the great elm. Louisa felt very old and bereft and lonely, but romance was not all gone. She put down in her diary that night, "Mr. Emerson kissed Anna, and I thought the honor would make even matrimony endurable." She may not have remained in that mood long, however, for a little later she wrote after going to see Anna in her new house and observing her sister's happiness in her new life. "Very sweet and pretty, but I would rather be a free spinster and paddle my own canoe." It was while she was still at home that the news reached her of the death of Theodore Parker. "I am glad to have known so good a man," she wrote of him. Behind that simple statement is all her gratitude for the cheerful welcomes when she was lonely and homesick, for counsel and encouragement in the midst of a great man's busy days, for the fortitude which he put into her heart to remain there forever. May had gone to teach in Syracuse, where their uncle Samuel Joseph May lived. Now that Anna was away, Louisa remained at home to help with the household and to earn what she could by her writing. She was restless and unstrung, For not only had unsettling changes come about in her own family, but the shadow of an enormous change was reaching over the whole country. No one could doubt that there was going to be a war, and as Louisa often said darkly to herself, "I'm a fighting May." This was the summer of 1860, and the tempest, though near, had not yet broken. Louisa's profession was beginning to prosper a little, although what she earned by her romantic tales was hardly more than a pittance. She realized that she was not doing her best. Even though she had achieved now her great desire, she was writing stories for that famous magazine whose editor had told her to stick to her teaching. She began on a novel, and growing more and more absorbed in it, she wrote day and night, burning with enthusiasm, afraid that the idea might escape her before it could be set on paper. The book was called Moods, her first long story. By winter she had written herself out on it, and put it aside for another novel which she called Success. In it appeared Theodore Parker under the name of Mr. Powers. It was the first time she had tried putting a definite person into any of her tales. Bronson Alcott had been going nearly every summer to make a lecture tour over the West, holding conversations, as he always called them. He was doing better and better with them, as, after the first endeavor, he had so cheerfully prophesied that he would. Now another pleasant thing was to come, which gladdened the hearts of all who had loved him so truly, and who had winced under the misunderstanding which, so far, was all that the world had offered him. Through the offices of Mr. Emerson, he was made superintendent of schools in Concord, and had a chance finally to see a growing generation of children get the benefit of what he knew to be the proper way of teaching. He had always known so well that the dreariness and long hours should be ended, that the dark rooms and the harsh pressure on struggling minds should be done away with. He had to wait very patiently until the world should know it too. We realize it 100 times better now, 70 years later, and we have most of us forgotten that Bronson Alcott knew all these things, the very first of all. He was loved in the schools and was applauded and approved, after such long waiting to be understood. When the spring term came to an end, there was a school festival with singing and marching, with little girls in white dresses and little boys in clean ruffled shirts. There had never been such a thing before. At the very end, a tall, good-looking boy came forward with a package. "From the children of Concord, as a token of our love and respect." Bronson opened the paper. It was a beautifully bound book. Can anyone guess what book? It was Pilgrim's Progress. That beautiful copy which belonged to the Temple School was gone forever, but here was another in its place, a treasure from which could push aside at last. A very bitter memory. Bronson Alcott blushed and stammered, and the children cheered until the big school building rocked again. It was close on the heels of that happy episode that there came another event, the overpowering news of the firing on Fort Sumter, the opening gun of the Civil War. People heard these tidings stunned, as though the roar of the cannon was in their very ears. War seemed a perfectly impossible thing, even when it can be seen coming nearer and nearer. It is still impossible to believe in when it has actually arrived, but it was so tremendous a fact that everyone must believe in the end, for everyone must bear his shame. During the first year, Louisa did what most other women do in wartime. She agonized, worked, worried, exulted, and worked again. Both sides at the beginning thought that there would be a brief, glorious campaign and then victory. Not until months had gone by and defeat, bereavement, and destruction had begun to come home to every person did both sides learn what war really is. The great outpouring of patriotism by all people alike was an extraordinary stimulus to a person of Louisa's character. She had always had a deep feeling on the subject of slavery. The terror-stricken runaway concealed in the big brick oven had haunted her memory ever since early childhood. Nor had her warmly grateful heart ever forgotten the unknown colored boy who had snatched her out of the frog pond when she was drowning. To her it was a glorious chance now to fling herself into work which was to help save these oppressed people and to free America from the fruit of its most terrible mistake. It was a tremendous experience to know that thousands were feeling the same thing, and that all were pressing forward to achieve the same high end. She understood all sorts of people. She was interested in them, and she had occasion to know and study every kind of woman, as they all toiled together at sewing, scraping lint, and preparing bandages. But the most of what she got out of this work, and out of the greater things which she did later, was the knowledge that here at last was a vent for her long-burning sense of injustice, kindled on that astounding day when she was such a little girl and had seen the fugitive hidden in the oven. She was teaching again that first winter of the war for Miss Elizabeth Peabody, was starting kindergartens here and there, and urged that Louisa take charge of one just opening in the Warren Street Chapel. She did not accept the task willingly, and was glad when it came to an end. It is worth remembering, for it was the last time that she ever taught. A queer little incident is recorded at this time. There was a great memorial meeting for John Brown, hero of Harper's Ferry, whose soul went marching on through the battle songs of that terrible struggle. Louisa could not go to that meeting, as she wrote in her journal, because she had no good gown. Cousin Lizzie Wells' silk dress had evidently come to the last of its days. But poor John Brown, in his butternut coat, why could Louisa not do reverence to his memory in her shabby garments of every day? War had not yet broken down some odd restrictions, which had stood too long. Louisa wrote a poem, however, which was read aloud to thousands in the solemn quiet of that great assemblage. Her real poems have been very few, put forward shyly at times of great feeling. The first 12 months dragged slowly toward their end. There had been no very glorious campaigns. Most of the victories had been on the side of the South. Battles had been fought, hospitals were filling up with wounded, and with the hosts of sick, which war brought in its train, there was greater and greater call for nurses. Louisa had seen the home soldiers march away down the Lexington and Concord road, past the gray stone walls behind which the fighting men of another war had taken cover, past the pink-blossomed apple trees. The flags were waving, the fifes were playing, the girl I left behind me, the drums were thumping, beating on the very hearts of those who saw them go. There is no experience in the world that can ever match that of seeing soldiers go away, of seeing the gaiety and the excitement, and knowing the black and hopeless tragedy which is behind it all. There is little that is so terrible as seeing strong, wholesome young men, every one of them beautiful in the flush of their high patriotism, as watching them go and knowing that they are surely to die. Louisa had all the desperate emotion which goes with such a sight. But the most of what she felt, consciously, was a frantic desire to go along. As the weeks passed and then the months, she knew that this excited wish had grown into steady resolve. Would it be fair, she wondered, to give up for a while her own battle with the security and happiness of her family? This was a time when there was no thought of security and happiness for anyone. There cannot be during a war. She was young, she was very strong, she was a good nurse, as all her family testified. Elizabeth had loved her ministrations more than those of anyone else. Cousin Lizzie Wells was loud in her praises of Louisa's care, which had brought her through a difficult illness. Abba Alcott could bear witness to the same thing. Louisa's nursing was vigorous and hopeful, cheerful and sympathetic, and had the background of a good deal of experience. It was plain that there was need for just such a person as herself. In November, she sent in her application, hardly knowing at just what moment she had come to the final decision. She went about the house, making her preparations, packing her clothes, doing last sewing for her family, that they might not miss her too much while she was gone. Will I ever come back? Was the question which repeated itself over and over within her mind. She was facing heavy work, hardship, and great danger from the pestilence and infections with which the hospitals were filled, but she knew that she could not resist longer. "The blood of the Meigs is up," she announced. If someone questioned her or protested, she answered only, "I must go." And that is the end of chapter 5.